and welcome to YouTube Masterclass. This is Aaron Sheley, and I am Dr. Aaron Sheley. For about 5 years, I've had my PhD, and I have PhDs in several schools. And three of them I'm teaching this masterclass for. It's USC, Harvard, and California Institute of the Arts, and that's run by Coursera. I have a good relationship with Coursera. This particular masterclass is doing well for them, and that's for them to decide the criteria of how they respect it. But things are going good, and we're getting by with getting units for collegiate standing in several schools that are always paying attention to what different master classes are doing. And I'm not saying that that by any means this is the most popular one, because there's many master classes. I just saw today there were tons of classes, and even in Coursera. And it's not really how many viewers you get, but how many people get through it is what really gets Coursera the money. But they do get viewership, like allegiance, and I'm not really sure that they run it like a business. Like sometimes you have to. They don't really, because they do. It's a real business, legit. So they do, but it's like Coursera, and it's just the way it is. We'll also run it like a school, where those with the gain in interest, knowledge, and capacity and capability and knowingness is formative. It means you're a formal being. It means you have respect for dignity, and you have respect for your ideals and what backs you up. It's not like a cul-de-sac of learning that you just go to the wrong side of the internet and it makes you think everything's going to explode on Earth. And I'm just saying, I don't know. I'm not saying that I know much about how all of it works, but I do know Coursera is a good place to enroll. And in this particular class, I'm adjunct to USC, Calarts, and Harvard. And I'm just repeating all this so you have my credentials, so you know who I am. And that's not to say that I'm egotistical. It's just to say I studied a lot. So really, it's not that, because you put yourself through a lot of work and you get here, but now we're teaching the Western. And in the Western, it's like this genre thing we need to look at. And Western genre's like a word that means category. And it means category in the sense that it's categorical, that is kind of like the imperative, which means there's multiple choices you can take, and one of them is right, and sometimes you glean on the choices to the top or bottom or left to right of the idea you wanted to say this is the answer to a question, or the question is always an answer, and I'm answering in questions in terms of human dialogue that goes on. Culturally, there's certain knowledges that pass through time that you think you see before, and then you realize, well, it's either a deceitful memory or maybe I did see something like that before. And I was like, well, then you've got your dreams becoming memories. Now, in cinema, it's like a dream becoming a memory. And that's because your memories hold so much of the mythology of your culture. And in all cultures, they have cultural mythology. Spain has mythology, America has mythology. And one of the mythologies is to have formative genres of a certain novel or music, or that there's certain, how do I put this, philosophy books geared at the idea of this imperative to transfer, French philosophy, for instance, Jean-Jacques Annaud, when he commented on film, and he's the guy from Passion of Joan of Arc that plays the clergyman, and he says, pass is no right where right is no pass. And I think that's kind of a comment on the culture, as well as something that it's if you're destroying all the exits, you might not have any exits. And that's just I'm saying that, furthermore, these impasses get down to a group of, movies that are Westerns in terms of their mythology and their tall tales. And I don't think that you can get the tall tales to the point that they're not real, or you're paranoid, or exaggerated about these mythologies, but pretty much like what I was saying a minute ago is like the mythology drops down in a box. It gives you one choice, but like in American movies, to glamorize it a little further, some people, because of whatever predilection or see whatever commercial and propaganda, they like certain types of films, even in America. Like there's some people that don't watch horror films and watch only musicals. There's some people that don't even know musicals exist and don't really think about that category, but like it could mean a lot of things. Because you could be like, well, is this a music video? And there's horror, sci-fi, fantasy, and then there's other genres too. It's like there's melodramas, there's uh, gangster films, there's period pieces, there's war movies, there's biopics. And I will go through and kind of explain them, except they look pretty much like genres we already recognize, like on like Netflix and stuff. Like if you're a movie buff, this seems really simple, and you're like, well, I'll choose the genre that I like. But most of the people, they're so into the genre, but they may not know about cinema, but they're grabbing movies off the shelf that look good to them, and they wouldn't really have ever had to have seen any other genre and really know that's what that means is genre. So there's other words for it, and you're like, well, if it's the category, it's not. You're not trying to like, tell you what to get, but like certain things about the movie attracts you in the title. And so, like in some ways, like that will gear you towards the narrative of a film, which is the story, and then that way it could be the iconography and mythology that comes from the language spoken about the Old West all to now in the Western. And there's a few other genres I didn't get to, like thriller, suspense thriller. We won't talk about it all, but the thing is we came to talk about Rio Bravo. And in the context that Westerns were built around folklore, there are often like characters in the silent era, like Harry Carey Jr., who I was talking about last time, is how he modeled like Tom Mix, and he was the essential character that would pull his gun like Tom Mix, and that would make him this kind of like showman, but it's still like Buffalo Bill, and that he's always shooting at the guy after the guy shoots at him, and he hits him first is a little weird, but they're standing like shot to shot reverse, and I don't. They kind of cross the 180 line almost on that shot, or to get right on it, And I'm talking about Straight Shooting by John Ford, and that was an early western. Now, what's weird is kind of the straight shooting genre, and then John Ford's other film, Three Bad Men. Well, that Howard Hawks was also a director of westerns, and he directed Rio Bravo. Now, remember, we looked at Rio Grande last week, and those were confusing. Don't mix them up. But Rio Bravo is Howard Hawks, and Howard Hawks was a genre shifter. And that's why I'm glad I brought up genre, because actually what he would do is shift from genre to genre. Like he made Only Angels Have Wings, and it's like a war film, female melodrama, male melodrama. It's pretty good, but there's some parts that are hard to take that you got to think they were added to the movie and were like planned somehow. Because if it's on camera, it was probably planned somehow for that to happen. But I don't know. I don't really look into that because I don't want to judge anybody for using something material that's good and they got it accidentally. And that's what we're in terms of directing these things. But that Howard Hawks shifted to the gangster genre with Scarface, the original. In Scarface, the original is the one where it's like hardcore gangster action, dude shooting. Paul Mooney plays Scarface. He's shooting dudes down in the street, riding in the back of a car, shooting at people, and it's a crazy movie. But it's good. And then you get like. And I don't mean crazy in like a medically offensive way. I mean like this movie, And I'm not trying to put it down when I say that it's a good kind of crazy. It's like so bombastic and good that like it switches around in ways that make you feel like you're on a fun ride or something. These westerns with these horse rides. Now the range western is the one where they go way out in the open. And that's where they go searching for something that's beyond the horizon, you know, like in The Searchers. That's where that name first came from, because it's like, go to the horizon and walk like the sun. And so I'm just saying that Howard Hawks, when he finally came to do a Western, and he'd done some certain Westerns, but he studied the films of John Ford, because like he did with all genres, was looked at the leaderboard of the genre and then direct like that. Like, not try to direct like that. Like, don't direct like his style, but the way he made the film is totally the way we're going to do it. And that it's pretty much out of the studio, which means going back to factories and how there's, you know, things that are on conveyor belts that are being built, you know, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just the technological industry that creates the better and bigger cinema, you know, the bigger size and the bigger color and the nice color, you know. I mean, this is in color. And the Technicolor that came in, and that it's all developed for different genres, but that the Western had its own technology for its own course. That some of it was filmed on a sound stage, yeah, but some of it's filmed in nature, like in Monument Valley. But again, Rio Bravo being Howard Hawks' film, he's modeling it after these, or even these early silent films like Straight Shooting and Three Bad Men. And you think, like, well, okay, like John Wayne's in it, and John Wayne's in most of John Ford's movies, and then um, Dean Martin's in it, and Ricky Nelson, and you can see them on the cover. That's fucking awesome. Now the thing is like, this movie is one of those lesser of the range, but the homebound type of western. But not really so much the homebound, because that still entails like a journey somewhere, like a long way away to get home. These guys are kind of ambiguous, because they're kind of good and kind of bad. That they're cowboys, and the mythology of the cowboy is like, you know, the cowboy hat, the cowboy boots, the belt, the vest. You know, the cowboy is from a long time, and that in Hollywood it's perfect because the fashion's in, so they want to dress like as like richly as they could, but be like these officers. But these guys are kind of like not really even cops or Range Rover type. Uh, you know, the like the Fort Apache guys. You know, like in the cavalry. They're not. These guys are like, they're the same actors almost, but from those kind of movies. But in this one, they're kind of like bandits at first, and then they take over the prison so one of their friends doesn't get killed. And it's Ricky Nelson, and he's going to get killed. But Dean Martin might get killed, and John Wayne might get killed for defending him. But they're all in this like, you know, closed space jail together. And so, what happens in Rio Bravo is they eventually go out and fight everybody that's trying to take over the prison. And I'm not going to tell you where they win or lose, but it's quite like the gunfight. You know, it's like everybody's ready for the gunfight. But there's some oddities in it, like there's some music in it because Ricky Nelson's in it. There's like it's like a musical western. I'm not sure, but it kind of is. And like that's okay because we like musicals too. And like Howard Hawks did Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and everything. He does musicals sometimes, you know. But like I don't understand. It's a great song in the film, but you'd think something so like hard boiled and hard to take in the passage of time. It's like, well, we look at it like they're desperate, and they would look at it like they were kind of like sad and curious, but we're thinking they're trying to be desperate and lost just by the way that the lyrics are. But what I like about the music is that it comes up naturally in the film, like it like works in, like Ricky Martin wrote it. Sorry, yeah, Ricky Nelson. Sorry, Ricky Nelson wrote it, and then he like would integrate it into the film by basing it on the storyline and where to put the music and the sort of lyrical poetry into the song. And it's a really good, well done. But it's like, is that on purposely there to jar you out of the movie? Kind of, not like as a buffer necessarily, but these guys are like not really scared of the Juggalos. I mean, and everybody else, these like outlaws and cattle rustlers coming to kill them all in this one prison. And just because they're defending the guy that like they may have to hang, later, and they have to keep him in prison for some reason. Now, that what's cool about this movie is that the music comes right after that. It's not to alleviate it; it's there to distract you right before the gun battle goes off. So you're like, did I really hear those guys just singing? But here's the trick: they sing another time in the movie when Dean Martin sings one of his songs and integrates it to the script when they get back to the jail and they're hiding out. And so it totally doesn't blur it out because like those two can sing, and John Wayne admits he can't sing, but I'm really looking for the lost tape where John Wayne does that falsetto of his. No, it's kind of a rude thing to say. I've never said anything rude about John Wayne, but actually I really like him. He's one of my top 5 favorite actors, and I'll get into why like much later in this class because we only have time like to look at Howard Hawks, and we can look a little bit at the characteristics that I like about John Wayne is that he's whether you like him or don't, he's fairly authentic. It's not just that he always acts that way in life. We don't know, but in the movies, he's got a certain sort of pattern he follows. Like stars do, and intricacies and eccentricities, and he really didn't play much movies where he was even angry at women, let alone like was treating women bad. But I could see where the feminists would get a little angry at like the fact that he would like pat some girl on the butt. It's weird because the censors of the day, they have other reasons for disliking it. Dislike that scene too, and they put it in a stagecoach to kind of defy him. But it kind of ruins that whole chivalrous John Wayne attitude that lasts even through McClintock. Not to mention that some of these women seem homebound, like they had to stay at their house at all times. And this kind of reflects again that nuclear age thing where everybody's hiding out from the bombs, so they're keeping everyone at home and they're keeping everyone like sheltered, and then two people are too paranoid to go outside. So it's not even xenophobia at that point because these guys don't see much of like, except for that they're really not commenting on anything politically in this film. It's not really an anti-prison film, although Assault on Precinct 13 came out by John Carpenter, and that's another movie based on Rio Bravo. And then you look at it, and there's like, a lot of movies, you gotta pay attention to what a director says or the movie says that it was from, because a lot of times they'll like readapt it in their own way and make it something so different that it doesn't connect to it. And they do that too, but then they do the one where it's like model the plot, just to like update the story. And there's where you get into Assault on Precinct 13, which really John Carpenter isn't exactly a strenuous, purposefully like political guy, but maybe he is. Maybe by hiding certain things throughout his films, he might have a political side, but that they're hidden isn't really what like politics asks for. They ask for like kind of propaganda that's going to make everyone love them forever, and I'm not really sure that always works because it depends on which side has other propaganda. And really, one thing that I dislike is that word really means something negative because it shouldn't. Like everybody's all, oh, it's conditioned response to media. I'm like, well, that's your own conditioning, I'm like, well, and then you're worried that like they're dissing that, and you're like, no, propaganda can be used in a good way. Like think about it. If someone's into Greenpeace or something and they propagandized it, I wouldn't feel too bad about that. If they could make propaganda about Greenpeace like developed, then they could maybe solve some problems. People would have a conditioned response to take care of Mother Nature. And I'm only coming up with this because, like, in the Western, we're talking about cowboy ethics, and it's like one of those genres that has the stagecoach, that has either the homebound or the range. And the range is out there searching the shot on location shots, usually in the Western setting, which is like horizons full of mountains and like cliffs. It's like Utah. Like in most of these westerns, they film in Monument Valley in Utah. And go through there, and Arizona and all those areas, they'll film in there. And those are on location, and that's like a range scene. And so I guess if the western has more range scenes where there's a cowboy on a horse, and he's walking along and talking to his friend, they have that shot in a lot of them. And I don't think that they weren't thinking about these things at that time. I think they were very intelligent. That it's not really a parody of itself or dated. I agree. So far be it for me to say that they were probably trying to spoof the film a little bit so people would get their mind off the final gun battle. And I said that, but what's weird is one gets shot and two get injured, but they still fell over winning. So it's like they might, if they hadn't loosened up during that song, but that makes us think that they're really in showbiz, and that's them drawing attention to their own persona in the characters that they play to the person, and that's one thing I like about John Wayne's acting is that he's really got the persona to fit the part that we don't know is like who he is one of the characters he always plays. You don't always like who I am character, you know? I mean, and I don't think that audiences pick that intentionally. They're like, can you play a guy we don't always like? But that's who he plays. I mean, that's, and I'm not trying to like smolder or anything. Like, you have to think that he only looks for the first example because he's a trained actor too. I mean, you can't be a star in Hollywood without being a trained actor. And like, unless you're a director star, and they're usually trained actor too because they have to act. And it's like, well, I could see your point on that they're not canny, like they're not posing or anything, but that like they're definitely the real deal can be seen in that. Not only that, they're on a mission that seems pretty deadly, and in a western, to be homebound and deadly at the same time, so that means the home's attacked or the prison's attacked, somewhere in the town, small town is attacked, but that they have to go and beat their attackers to it, but they have to go slightly out. And there's usually this theme in westerns, like in High Noon, where someone gets out in the middle of a like square, and Gary Cooper's out in the middle of the square at the end, and he's standing there on the sand, and he's like shooting up in the air, and it's like the camera rolls away, and that's the final battle when it's done, and he's not shooting up in the air, but he shoots all those guys, and he's got finally someone joins him in the battle, and he has to fight all like the ultimate, bandits or whatever. But in this movie, they go to it. Like, he waits for them and kind of has a trap. But in this one, they surprise attack him and go to them and find him and shoot him. And that's like a technique that you can use even in straight shooting or whatever. But usually, they end up meeting in the street on the silent films. Or like somewhere there, the two characters end up meeting and they'll have the gunfight. So, what the hey? I mean, Rio Bravo's an amazing film for otherwise. Let's see what this review says. It says Jeff Andrew from Time Out Film Guide. Arguably Howard Hawks' greatest film. Beautifully acted, wonderfully observed, and scripted with enormous wit and generosity. Yeah, so I mean, Howard Hawks is really a great writer. And he's been working since the silent era. He passed away in like, I think, the 80s or 90s. I didn't really look that up because I don't really like to check the time that they passed away unless it relates somehow in an important point that I need to get across. And it really isn't there on this one. And like, Howard Hawks seems like a nice guy in these, and that he was an Air Force pilot in World War II. Totally renovates this movie as kind of a what you would have to do sometimes to get someone out of POW camp. And I know that's a really distressing thing to say, but otherwise, what would necessitate all these, shotguns and things? And that's actually what they're talking about in the dialogue. So that it's really well scripted, but that it's like this cathedral of these ultimate lovers could be visited. It's like we could be somewhere in paradise, but now we're here in a stinky jail cell. This guy's a POW from the Civil War, and we've got to protect him, and because he's like the last hostage, and now we've got to fight all these dudes. But they do it in that's the narrative. That's a beautiful script, but they do it in this like comedic overtone, like almost to the point where they're like, well, that they like each other as men is kind of this, it's like a homosexual response, but like people get really angry about that when you're telling them that, they usually can sense it. In my region, it's like, well, I didn't want to think that they were gay. I've even heard homosexual friends of mine like talk about how they don't want to think of them as gay because they seem so straight. And I'm like, well, that's fair, but like my assemblage is that there's like a gay element to every Western, not just because sometimes gay people watch them and there's gay people now, but it's that back then they wanted their image to reflect the total availability to like every man and woman on earth. And I don't know if they still do that. I'm not really into like checking out what how people do it now. I know they have to be trained actors, but to sell your image, not in a bad way, because selling your image doesn't mean making money. It means like your image goes out, you know, and that's the way you get it out there is you put it out there. And if it kind of has this role that's both androgynous but kind of bisexual, it totally is a Hollywood style way back when the Bohemians joined Griffith and Judith of Bethulia. Don't even question me on this. I mean, even the silent film was, and they'll kind of comment on it, but they didn't really comment on it and how it was like cool to be this or cool to be that. Like they don't really treat Indians well in the film, but at the time they were thinking, well, we're showing Native Americans in the film and we're treating them really good. So, but this Howard Hawks one doesn't have Native Americans, but that they were showing them as like rough and tidy warriors or whatever doesn't make sense because they're always the enemy in those earlier westerns. And then Red River is like the Howard Hawks one. And yet they're not like the guys themselves, though they would play that part, didn't really mean they were for all those that are freaking out. But I think they were in ways because, in Bohemian culture, it was necessary for everybody to kind of get with everybody. And they were doing that like in some Dean Martin movies, like The Love Trap, is it? If he's in that? Or is that Cary Grant? It's like, well, I'm not trying to combine all their films at once, but I'm sure they were putting out, in a good way, a gay image, as well as definitely a straight image, though, and dominantly straight. Not to challenge the subtext of the code of cinema is usually to have the male spectator identify with the male and gaze onto when he gazes onto the women, it's like she's an object and he's a subject. So he becomes the subject, but at the same time, if he's subjective, he would lower himself to the angle of objective, which there is no example of this on film. But I think that's why women were in that role of objectivity. Whether that came about from technology and culture, it usually always does. Sometimes you got to be tricky with it though and see if they're sending it up and making fun of it. It's like some things can seem really offensive in retrospect, but if they were done in comedy, that doesn't necessarily justify it, but it could be political satire. And in this, there's a little bit of political satire, because like I said, if it's about a guy getting lifted out of a POW camp, then what does that remind you of? Freaking World War II that he just got out of in his fighter pilot action. So now we're thinking, well, if he got saved from the fighter pilot Howard Hawks, then they're not going to execute them even if they have political differences, whether they do or not, because there's some people, don't forget, that have political differences within their own party. And that means that, like, there's sometimes they're splitting hairs, and whether or not you're the same exact party as the person, in America anyway, it doesn't mean you agree with any of their standards or whatever, no matter what their standards are. You can't really judge a man's standards, but and that's the whole point. And so they keep him alive, and this is kind of teary-eying because they get him out, and then they're singing along, and then he almost dies in the final gunfight that they volunteer him in to save him. And that's the whole reason they locked him in the jail, but it's not done ironically. It's almost like in Assault on Precinct 13, where they have no other way to solve the problem. And we don't figure out totally the reason why, but we kind of do in the dialogues between the characters. So it's really got a lot of good stuff in it, and like I don't really think that, going back to the Native Americans, I don't think that the people of the time really disliked them. I don't know enough about the history, but I know that they were obliterated at the end of the Trail of Tears after Custer died in Geronimo. had to go tell everybody in the Spanish American War. That's just some knowledge to have when thinking about the other side. But it's not the other side. See, because in school and everywhere else they taught that. But in the Western format, it's like escapism, and we just think that's the way it is. And the actors do know that. They're not in the Old West, you know. But that it's dated a little bit is like, well, that's just your decision on what kind of filmmaking they made. Because if you don't think there's kind of some camp to it, well, it's like high end camp, you know, with Howard Hawks. He's not really much of a low cult guy. Because Howard Hawks is very elegant and mild and like, has this style that, you know, in black and white, it's kind of like this beautiful color. And the Howard Hawks' films always have these moral dilemmas, but that you can tell it's not about the moral dilemma. That's like usually the pretext. And Howard Hawks has these movies that examine like characters, but usually have to go on an action adventure or like just an action film, you know. Because usually the adventure dies as soon as you get out your door and someone shoots at you in Scarface, you know. And I'm just saying that he did really exciting, really entertaining. His art was to have the genre that he was building on be used in every movie. Not only the same genre in a couple of movies, but different genres all the way. And I looked at his filmography once, and it doesn't look like he missed a genre. I mean, really, it's hard to miss a genre except musicals in the silent era when you're as prolific. But that he was extremely prolific all throughout his career is true. And this comes, actually, hang on. Well, I was wrong about the date, but we'll discuss. It wasn't 1945. That was Red River. And I got those two confused. But that this is about nuclear containment, true. But that it's about World War II because Howard Hawks fought in World War II. But that means good news. Red River is also about World War II. And it's not just in ways they fight the Civil War that they're reflecting on World War II or a world war in any way. But I think someone that's making a film with a Western, there's usually a war going on somewhere, and it's not always with the Native Americans. So in the Western, and like, even though they didn't even see the war in Rio Grande, they knew it was going on and were training up for it. But they did kind of see the consequences it had on on that fort. And so you can't just look for like an allegory like that. It's more like the nationhood has always had this interest in these westerns, kind of attract people with their interest in like historical melodrama or like historical, and it's like the western will stretch out and reach kind of a peak all the way throughout its career already before these times, already in the silent era it's peaking out. But it's like it always keeps the same text that it made on like Iron Horse, basically from the silent era by John Ford. And there's a wars going on in that one, like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There's wars going on. So I'm building this pretext that we have this sense in America like Hegelian, and it's like the pretext for ending a war. And I've said this before, but if there's war going on, America thinks, well, the world has called on us to go over and end the war. But this can be problematic because they might be both sides in the middle of battle. And I'm not saying that this happens, but it seems like they cream both sides. And this could be because they have to end the war. You know, they could even cream their own dudes. I'm not saying they do that in America, or they might, or that they ever do that. But they're supposed to end the war without creaming their own guys in Hegel. You know, because if you cream your own guys, well, where's it going to be for the next battle? And by that I mean like blow them down or shoot them down or blow them up. But to end the war, you got to do what? And then you get like this Machiavelli, the end justifies the means. And so now you're like, well, why don't we Doctor Strange love it and drop bombs on everyone, you know? And they've discussed all these things. And so like in the 60s, you can see them talk about World War II, but they're more talking about like the Cold War, you know? Because in World War II, that's when they dropped atomic bombs. But here's this movie that's like saying one dropped will destroy all the world, you know? And maybe it's like, Well, depends on where you drop it, you know. But had they not dropped that bomb in Russia, would it really blown up the world? And there's I don't know. Or is that really the only cause of the end of the world is blowing up Russia? I don't want to think about what Kubrick was thinking about that time, but it was more of like a peace and disarmament thing with that. It was like peace and love. This was like peace and love from 1959. I had that wrong about, I think I said 44, 45. That was when Red River came out. And it's more of an allegory of like the Old West than like a war film. So it doesn't always matter when it comes out, you know, because usually they don't make war movies right when the war is going on. But allegories can be seen of the end war aspect of about doing whatever you can to, even in Stagecoach, to shoot down the dudes that are coming after you, you know, in high noon or whatever, and then get on with it. It's like if you know, cause it's like they have to have these settings that are like there's always somebody involved with a sheriff, but the sheriff is always involved with the war. But in this one, the sheriff's not really the sheriff. He becomes that by hanging out and doing cool things and nice things for people. And that's funny because that happens in High Noon too. But they have different ways to solve it. Not to judge one on the other. Howard Hawks, he does these things where he kind of beatifiques the narrative, beatifiques the characters. That means he makes it all as aesthetically pleasing as possible with a well built set. And he has like huge sets sometimes. And then he works a lot in the studio with his interiors, like a Hollywood classical director. But this is like post classical, like neoclassical type work here. It's post classical in the sense that you get this romantic edge that's kind of more expressive, like veering towards modernistic expressive. But Howard Hawks seems to want to classicalize it because he puts it in kind of this context that's like, but all the assemblage of this film, everything else, is just like how we used to do it in Hollywood, and that how we used to do it in Hollywood is another way of putting that's how they do it now. But like that's also because they like to form movies like older Hollywood, their movies that they trained on, and then kind of do them in like pairs. You know, I don't know if Rio Lobo has to be a Howard Hawks movie, and it's a remake of, or not a remake, but a sequel to Rio Bravo. And there's actually another one, El Dorado, that is much more of a remake of Rio Bravo than the other one. Kind of has the same notion, but it's one of those films where they built it like different than the original on purpose, but they got the idea from there. You know, you can say that about any movie in any context. In postmodernism, it's like every movie reflects every movie, and like that's impossible to do because genres again say that. Well, this movie can't be a horror film, but it's kind of a musical and it's a western. It's not very scary, but like there's some suspenseful parts, you know. And it could be scary if you're dealing with the fact that you're so into the story or the theater of it that you think that the characters are no longer the names of the stars, but the characters of the film. Whether we know the names of most characters in a film, sometimes they're really important, you know, for the movie. And they're always important for the plot. But sometimes people, when they're in escapism, it isn't just like they're escaping because they need to take the stress out. It's like they're escaping because that's the whole point of it, is to pretend like you're somewhere you've never seen in an event you've never done and still feel like you're there. Now, Howard Hawks is excellent at that, but at the same time, sometimes in cinema, aestheticizing the work can be a little drawing attention to the expressive because it can get so perfectly cast, and that's not a bad thing, perfectly like built and perfectly organized to film that like you can tell that they knew what they were doing, but they're also spreading the message, this is how you make a good film. And that's not to be arrogant or egotistical like Howard Hawks was confused for. He's saying, we make good films because we're told that by everyone who sees it. And that's kind of a democracy deciding who's a good director or not, because they're saying, well, like, yeah, we did say he was good, but not because of the propaganda that this is always good. But like, you know, we've seen so many of his films, or he's come so far as a filmmaker, that we know he's a good filmmaker. And there are still critics who like him now, so we really know he's a good filmmaker. Because there's Joseph McBride, who wrote the Hawks on Hawks book, that has a lot of these details. And he's, some say they sugarcoat the pill with the genre becoming the form and the form becoming over stylistic. But that's one of the reasons you're seeing this is because you're like, okay, that seemed like it was nothing I'd seen before and I liked it, but how did that happen? But then you're also escaping in that world, like, I'm suspending my disbelief and I'm letting it happen because it's something I'm experiencing, which is theater and cinema does this really well, but like kind of post, especially this way of seeming real, even though it's dealing with the unreality, and you're in there with the movie watching it, and it's like that whole thing in Celine and Julie Go Boating, where they keep going into the movie. It's an okay movie that they keep going into. It's part of Celine and Julie Go Boating, but it's a different movie with these French maids, and they're like sitting out in France, and they're like, they take this magic candy and disappear into this movie, and it sounds like strange, but the fact that it's kind of Fouillardian is weird, but not really that weird because in France they kind of copy that style. So back to the fact of you copy all these different styles and then you go into the movie. Well, in the classical way, you never really go into the movie except for like Wizard of Oz, and it's totally concealed, unless it's a movie about movies usually. And there's other ones that have like, any mention of media in a movie actually, and they have these all throughout the history, is when the media is represented. And now you can kind of get a knack of who the director is by the way the politics are representative. And again, Howard Hawks, though he combined musical with Western, in the postmodern era, you have like all the genres mixed together in different ways, so you can become just like it makes you really intelligently able to switch between genres and postmodernism. But nobody really, I mean, you still feel like you're on a jarring ride, but it could be a different effect to say that you're doing one thing or the other. It's like montage or mise en scène. It's like if I hold this out, and then Howard Hawks is kind of both, like he'll use both dependent on the genre. So montage is the other option, and that is the editing or the way it's assembled or the way the assemblage moves in front of the camera. And really, there is some wizardry with cinema that I'll never be able to explain, and that's how it commits an image onto a screen, and it fascinates us so much that we go into that world pretty much knowing we'll come out alive. I mean, from the movie, but that the experience is gonna like brighten us or heighten us or depthen us. How they do that with just a reel of film stock or anything going across a board, I love that. I'm totally excited about film, but I don't know if it can't be propaganda because we all know that Hollywood's criticized for not being propagandistic enough. But then it's like, but that they're entertaining when they're putting out commercial images that are like everybody wants in like power or sex or money. And those all go back into the idea of like westerns all the way to the 90s with like Tombstone and Unforgiven, where the decadent Old West falls apart and it's like the end of the Old West and everything's shaken and destroyed, but it's got all these side pockets of other genres going on, doesn't distract that it's a Western. So at some point you're like, post-modernity even got an idea of the classicism, you know. So, and then you have these kind of but it's movements that are general to the films that came out at this time. Either if it's modern from the 60s on, or if it's classical before that. And you got to think this is right on the edge of that. Like 1959, and it's the end of, again, Hollywood classical cinema pretty much goes out of style the next year with Psycho by Hitchcock. And we're not here to talk about horror films yet. We'll talk about that in another class. And we did a little bit in film criticism if you're interested. But that started the modern era. It doesn't surprise me that Rio Bravo, in this 100th anniversary edition, still entertains today, and it's because it's so immaculately beautiful, and that's why I think the style is recognized by film buffs as not dated, but eloquent and different than today, not making it better or worse, but that's the decor they went for. Now, that sometimes on VHS, the transfers will be really thickly made, and I'm not really going to discuss VHS transfers because there's a lot about that I don't know. But even then, you can kind of get across a point if all you have is the old, DVD or whatever. I have a lot of movies that are just DVD, and DVD is an excellent form of like what Laserdiscs used to be, and now Laserdiscs are DVDs, and they're affordable, kind of, you know, and it's like people are still entertained by the fact that it's like a musical western, but it's serious because they don't have to shoot these guys that are coming to kill them. And they're only in there because they escaped and got him out of there, got Ricky Nelson's character out of there, and that they're all angry at him kind of at first, but it's kind of funny. It's like watching, it's like the Marx Brothers or something. And it's like first, and then like by the end they're like totally sullen and exaggeratingly humorless, and but they're still like friends, kind of, but they kind of have this odd plan to go on, and it's like Assault on Precinct 13, where the resolution isn't plain, but that's a good thing because, like, it's though it contains the costume design of a classical western, really, from all the way back to Drums Along the Mohawk and A Color Film with Western, and then that it's kind of drab and feely isn't really to communicate different voices. It's like the movie is moving towards an end-war attitude, but this time it's not soldiers, it's not Native Americans, but that it's still the same old cowboy enemy, a cattle rustler, makes me wonder what, and I don't even want to ask. I didn't just say that word, because I don't know. I've known some people that were really offended at that word, and they must have been in Hollywood, and now it's pretty innocuous to say that because nobody knows its original meaning, and if they do, they'd be offended. But that the guys are just basically, they call them like, back in the day, they're like, well, they're bad cowboys. But the cowboys are always bad. There's a bad, good and evil side to every cowboy. The mortality of a cowboy explains that he was so legendary, it doesn't matter whether he was good or evil. When legend becomes fact, print the legend. And so it's like they're doing that on purpose, like that it's a this is the old legend dying, This is the movie about the old legend dying. And they're not doing it in like a glib way. They've researched these things all the way through. They connect it with the historiosity of the genre. It's like each movie in the future is an advancement on the genre, but not to make it a better film. And not to say the other ones had inadequacies because of technology. It's just to show you how you do it different with the new technology and everything. And that there are different drawbacks to some and drawbacks to others. You'd have to really get down and study 35 millimeter film stock and how it looked in Technicolor, like close up, and how they shot each frame. And speaking of that, we're about to end, but speaking of that, The Searchers has that film I said where it's showing all the way through. It was showing, this was a few years ago that it ended. It's a 5-year span of time in that movie, and you really feel like you're being time traveling along with the Searchers, but that they put the Searchers every frame in motion at the length and duration that it would have to fit 5 years, and so this like post cinematic Searchers was going on, and Rio Bravo being the same year as the Searchers, and that we will talk more about the Searchers later on a different point of view than we had before. But if we talk about Rio Bravo having the length and duration of itself, it would pretty much be the same film that it is now. And Howard Hawks experimented with that. Not that it's one long take like Rope, but the time duration that it took, just like in High Noon, was kind of like, did that just happen in the real time? And not by meaning that the events were real, but the time duration that it was the length of time that sort of thing would have happened in that, not in that time, but that the length of time of duration of the film, if you expanded it for how long the narrative was keeping track of duration, pretty much the same. as each other. So that's interesting because a lot of westerns span time, like The Searchers, and so maybe the range one spans time just because it's a bigger shot and you're looking at longer distance, or that the shot that's smaller seems to go faster was the whole reason that in the silent era, and even, well, not really classical cinema, but they crank the camera in different ways with the switch on the camera. It's like the point of that is if you looked at the time, the duration, of course, like the time it takes for that kind of a thing to happen, then how they get it set up in a film like that, even when it's edited, which may actually make it harder to do, shows that Howard Hawks, like he advertised himself and everyone else did, was a pretty good director. Not because they advertised it, not because they all agreed, but you can kind of tell by the way he's making the film and how he sets up the characters. And Rio Bravo, never better. All right, thanks everybody. We'll talk next time. We have a lecture on the Western. Thank you.